There we go. All right. Trying to remember what it was.
I've got my notes, but I don't think I think it had something to do.
Shalom, Rabbi Judy.
Hi, shalom.
Oh. Something to do with, you don't know? Okay, we'll remember.
Yeah.
Sephora, do you remember what it was that Joyce had a question about last week?
And
Say again? What was it regarding?
There was, I'm not sure.
it wasn't Sukkot, I don't think, but I think it was before we started talking about Sukkot. There was something in your
Passover?
notes.
We'll look it up.
Okay.
There was a question. I just looked at some of the previous things, just kind of spotted through them so I'd know what I was doing today at the last minute. But I know there was a question about why we eat dairy on Shavuot.
Yes, that's what the question was. Why do we eat dairy on Shavuot, Rabbi?
Why? I might have to look it up just like you do. I know it's traditional. I don't have the absolute answer for that, but I could look it up.
Here we go. I have a document about it. Let's see. Dairy on Shavuot. I know I've taught about it before. Here we go.
Yeah, I just don't remember. It's.
Let's see. Okay. I haven't looked at this source sheet since 2021. So
Yeah, I'm thinking it's because we study a lot on Shavuot. There are a lot of study groups, and so we don't really have the time, to cook necessarily. And because we're studying, it's similar to like a Shabbat type thing. So we do dairy.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, but I have also taught it, but it's not anything earth shattering.
Right.
Okay?
It looks
It's
like
more that it's become the custom, I
right.
think.
And it looks like there's a custom, or there's this verse from Song of Songs.
Mm-hmm.
Honey and milk are under your tongue. So was probably added on, like you're saying,
Right.
probably added on later. Here we go.
Sacrifices.
Here we go. So on Shulchan Aruch, we're going to learn about in several weeks, but Shulchan Aruch is a halachic text, a text about Jewish law, written in the 16th century, and it was written in Israel by a rabbi who's kind of from Israel, kind of from Spain area, and then it was glossed over by a rabbi in Poland. And so he says the rabbi from Yosef Karo from Sfat says, we have the custom to spread out plants on Shavuot in the synagogue and houses as a memory for the happiness of receiving the Torah. We have a custom everywhere to eat dairy food on the first day of Shavuot. And it seems to me the reason is, actually, this is the Polish rabbi. It is like the two foods that are taken on the evening of Pesach, a reminder of the Korban Pesach and reminder of the Korban Chagiga. So those are two different sacrifices,
right?
So we eat a dairy food followed by a meat food. So and we bring them 2 loaves on the table in place of the altar, and thus there will be a reminder of the 2 loaves that were brought on the day of Bikurim, which is the day of the first fruits. So we're not just eating meat, we're eating meat and something not meat, and the not meat is dairy, I suppose. Let's see. It's another one. Oh, and like you're saying too, right, that the meat needs a lot of preparation.
Right.
But when they got back down from the mountain, they were pressed for time, so they chose to eat dairy instead.
Right. Like everything in Judaism, there's not just one explanation.
Oh, here, I like this one too. Restraint and self-control. We do dairy because we don't crave it as much, even though, I don't know about you, but ice cream, I crave ice cream a lot more than I crave a steak.
I do too, and chocolate.
Great. And then the Torah's words are as sweet as honey and milk. You do too? So maybe we should just eat chocolate on Shavuot and nothing else. I love
Works
it.
for me.
I love this class because I always relearn things.
Right.
All right. Let's talk a little bit about Jewish diversity. Our timing today is really interesting because different rabbis are coming on at different times, and they're not all coming on at times that make sense with the order of Jewish history. So it'll be interesting. Couple things to keep in mind. I'll tell us things to keep in mind, give us a really short history, and then I'll let Rabbi Judy speak for a little bit. So two things to keep in mind. One is that the movements that the rabbis here are talking about have their origins in Europe and in Europe, mostly Western Europe, but in Europe or Central Western Europe and here in the States. So, but Jews live in a whole lot of other places in the world. So we are really talking, today we're talking about movements that a lot of American Jews practice or are a part of, but are a whole bunch of other variations on Judaism than what we're talking about today. We'll revisit that a little bit later after all the rabbis talk. Another thing to recognize is that even within these movements, there's a whole lot of diversity. So what I'm going to say about conservative Judaism is my perspective on conservative Judaism, and I'm going to talk as broadly as I can, but I'm definitely missing some opinions when I'm talking. So I would imagine it's going to be the same thing with each of the rabbis who are going to be speaking today. So just know that I am not the voice of conservative Judaism. Another thing to keep in mind is a word that I've probably thrown out a bunch talking to y'all, but the word halakha. Halakha is Jewish law. Halakha has its origins first in the Torah, but as we've learned, Jews take law not just from the Torah, but from the Talmud, which is written 0 to 600 after the second temple was destroyed. We today can't really follow everything in the Torah word for word because we don't have a temple or we don't have a tabernacle to make sacrifices in. So instead of sacrifices, we prescribed different types of rituals and different types of prayer. And so our Talmud really started establishing what those practices look like. And then our halakha was kind of sharpened and changed by later commentaries. So today, a lot of our modern practice in movements that follow halakha come from, and even in movements that don't follow halakha, they come from this 16th century text that we just quoted from as well, the Shulchan Aruch. So our Jewish law isn't just what's written in the Torah. It's not literally what's written in the Torah. It's kind of derived from Torah as its base text. Some history to know before we dive into specific movements. So our modern Jewish denominations are really a response to the Enlightenment and emancipation in the 18th century. So what that means is, when I say emancipation, is in places like Germany, before the 18th century, Jews were kind of a separate class of people, but they became full citizens when Germany was really unified. They became full citizens in Germany. Similar things were happening in places like France. And in America, we were established as full citizens, but of course, America was first established late 18th century. So late 18th century, early 19th century, we became citizens of countries rather than just Jews, right? So the Jewish world was grappling with, what does it mean to be Jewish and to be American, or Jewish and German? And so as an embrace of the modern world, Reform Judaism kind of was the first movement to establish itself as a movement. So in Reform Judaism, they said, you know what, we are Germans first, later Americans first when it came to America, because it really started out in Germany and then later made its way to America. We are Germans first, Jews second. And so they prayed in the vernacular, they prayed in German. They incorporated parts of church life, Protestant church life, into their services. So music that sounded like German music, clothing, clerical robes that looked like Protestant clerical robes. They didn't have they wouldn't wear the distinctive prayer clothing like a kippot, like a head covering or a prayer shawl. They did away with kashrut, with keeping kosher, and did away with keeping Shabbat. So a lot of the mitzvot, a lot of the commandments were honored, but not kept to the T, because in this new Enlightenment world, there's that embrace of individualism, right? Not only are we citizens of a country, but we're also individuals. We can make our own choices. So halakha, Jewish law, has a great menu of choices, but as an individual, I get to choose which of those are important to me, right? That initial Reform Judaism really focused on the lessons that could be learned from Torah and prophets, the rabbis, holiday traditions, but didn't see it as necessarily as law. At the same time, there was this response to Reform Judaism in Orthodox Judaism. So Orthodox Judaism was not a thing before Reform Judaism came around. It was just what Jews did, right? They kept the halakha, they kept the law in everyday life. And it's just what they did as Jews. Now, not to say that all Jews before the 18th century followed all of the laws all of the time, right, but that was just what Judaism was, right? What was assumed, right? But once Reform Judaism was founded, the Orthodox movement kind of came as a response to Reform Judaism. And a good example of that is the Khatam Sofer, who is a commentator in the 19th century. He says anything new is forbidden by the Torah. That was kind of the attitude of Orthodox Judaism. For Orthodoxy, the Torah and later specific writings were both revealed by God at Sinai, and therefore their obligations are entirely binding. So the variations in Orthodoxy then and later today really depend on the rabbis, the specific textual interpreters each school relied on. Conservative Judaism came about after kind of as a middle ground between Reform Judaism and Orthodoxy. And so we'll learn a little bit more about conservative Judaism. I'll explain a little bit about my experience and my perspectives on conservative Judaism later. And then in 15 minutes or so, we'll learn a little bit about Reconstructionist Judaism, which came out of conservative Judaism, but not really. So stay tuned for that. Okay. So I would love to invite Rabbi Judy to speak. Many of us here in Shreveport know her as the rabbi of B'nai Israel in Monroe, but she has a very illustrious life outside of Monroe as well. She is an accomplished Jewish musician and officiates a whole lot of services for a whole lot of people. You're about 20,000 places at once, so I'm glad that you're able to be here as one of those 20,000 places.
Thank you, Rabbi Sidney. And I found out that I was doing this morning. So I do not have, normally I would have a wonderful PowerPoint and visuals for you to look at because I'm a very visual person. But unfortunately, you're just going to have to listen to me talk. So I'm going to give you a very brief overview of Reform Judaism. I have been a Reform Jew all of my life. I have not always liked everything about the type of Reform Judaism that I grew up with, which was known as classical Reform, and I'll talk a little more about that. I grew up in Alexandria, and I currently live in Alexandria again. I did escape for about 15 years, so I was able to see the broader world, and especially the broader Jewish world. and I'm very thankful for that. So the what we know in Reform Judaism is our umbrella organization. It's called the Union for Reform Judaism. It was founded in 1873 by Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise, who was very instrumental in getting the Reform movement started in America and in getting our first prayer book and in starting our first rabbinical seminary for both Reform rabbis and cantors. The URJ, the Union for Reform Judaism, was formerly known as the Union of American Hebrew Congregations. And it was called that. The name was changed in 2003. And I personally actually like the name change. As Rabbi Sidney said, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, Jews became citizens of the European countries where they lived. And so they were able to dress like their neighbors. They were able to study at the schools and universities where their neighbors went, and they were able to work in the working regular community. So they very much embraced this form of assimilation, both in Europe and also when they came to America. The first Reformed temple opened in Germany in 1810. And it was under the leadership of a rabbi named Abraham Geiger. He was a scholar and a change maker. He was kind of a rabble rouser. He wanted to stir up things a little bit. And so he wanted to make it easier for Jews to live within a modern society. So he included German in the prayer book in addition to Hebrew. He got rid of the separation of men and women sitting separately and allowed people to sit wherever they wanted. He also did away with 2-day observances of some of our festivals. Most Orthodox Jews and conservative Jews will celebrate, for instance, Rosh Hashanah for 2 days, or they celebrate Pesach for an extra day. Reform Judaism did away with that. So we only have 1 day of Rosh Hashanah and 7 days of Passover. He also instituted the participation of a choir with services. Now, of course, when these German Reform Jews, at the time they were called Reformed, and I cringe today when I hear people say Reformed Jews, because the term now is reform without the ED on it. But originally they were reforming the religion, so they were called Reformed. And when they came to America, they were called the Reformed Society of Israelites. Doesn't that sound lovely? And they organized in 1824. The first Reform congregation was a Sephardic congregation in Charleston, South Carolina, and it was established in 1841. So that was really the first permanent Reform Jewish synagogue in the United States. Isaac Mayer Wise came along in about 1846. He moved here to America and was very, like I said earlier, was very instrumental in getting the Reform movement going in America. He established really the first union, this Union of American Hebrew Congregations that would oversee all of the Reform congregations in America. He started Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati in 1875, which is still our major seminary for ordaining rabbis and cantors in the Reform movement. He also prepared the first Jewish prayer book. And I grew up with that first Jewish prayer book, an incarnation of it. It was called the Union Prayer Book. It sounds very, Big Brother is watching sort of thing. But it was primarily in English. When I grew up in Alexandria in a classical Reform congregation, the only Hebrew I ever remember hearing really was the Shema. We did recite the Kaddish, but you may or may not know that that's actually Aramaic and not Hebrew. So I heard very little Hebrew growing up, and most of it was in English. As Rabbi Sidney said, our leaders wore robes. They did not, goodness gracious, they would never think of wearing a kippah or a talit. And we had our hymns were just like any other church hymn. We had organs that played the music because we wanted to be like our Christian neighbors. Even as a small child, that ruffled my feathers. It just didn't compute with me being in a synagogue. So even as a young child, I found I didn't feel comfortable with that in a synagogue. And as I grew and traveled and went to other synagogues around, other Reform synagogues, I found that that wasn't the only way, and that wasn't the only prayer book. And I learned glorious melodies and lots of tunes in Hebrew, and the organ started being replaced by a piano or a band even. And music is a huge part of Reform services. Many Reform congregations around the country have a band. I told them when they hired me in Monroe, I told them a few things. I said, this is going to be how it is if you hire me. And one of those things was, you will never hear the organ played again in this synagogue as long as I am here. And the organ to me just screams church, and it has no place in the synagogue as far as I'm personally concerned. Now, thankfully, I'm thankful that our Reform movement has become more traditional in the past 20 or so years. You see most of the leaders who lead Reform congregations now do wear a kippah, and when they read from the Torah, they do wear a talit. You'll also see congregants wearing these things. I used to go to our conventions of the URJ, which are every 2 years. And when I first started going, it was in the 80s. Nobody wore a kippah or a talit. The last time I went to one of our conferences was a few years before COVID, and it was in San Diego. And I would say that 90% of the 5,000 Reform Jews who were there had a kippah on, and probably 80% of them had a talit on for the Saturday morning service. So that's a huge change in the years that I've been involved in Reform Judaism. This is kind of funny. Rabbi Sidney mentioned, the keeping kosher. There are some Reform Jews who keep kosher, but most of them probably don't. This is just a funny fact. In 1883, the very first class of rabbis was ordained at HUC, Hebrew Union College. There were 4 graduates, 4 rabbinic students who were named rabbis. And at the celebration dinner that they had for these rabbis, it's become known as the treif banquet. Treif, of course, is food that is not kosher. And this banquet was attended by both Jews and non-Jews, and the meal consisted of clams, crabs, frog legs, ice cream, and cheese. It's shocking, okay? Now, most of the Reform congregations I've been associated with in modern times don't allow treif to come into their synagogue. So you may not keep kosher, but most of the Reform congregations I know won't allow pork products or shellfish and things like that to come into the synagogue building. The Reform movement has also been known for being one of the most progressive movements to embrace things that are on the fringe. We ordained the first woman rabbi in 1972. We were the first movement to do that. We were the first movement to make a resolution against the Vietnam War. We were the first movement to come out in support of LGBTQ people. Way, way, way long ago. We were also the first movement to come out in favor of patrilineal or matrilineal descent as far as somebody being Jewish. Traditionally, the line of Judaism flows matrilineally through your mother. But in 1983, the Reform Jewish Rabbinic Movement said that an individual's Jewish identity may derive from either matrilineal or patrilineal descent. So if your father had Jewish roots but your mother did not, in the Reform movement you are now considered Jewish. So we are the most progressive movement. There's a branch of Reform Judaism known as the World Union for Progressive Judaism. This is our international branch that works with Reform Jewish congregations in other countries and trying to make there be more of these around the world. Rabbi Sidney mentioned the word halakha, and I want to mention one other word that's similar, and the word is minhag. That basically means local custom. I've sung at hundreds of Reform congregations throughout North America and even in other places in the world. They all have their own minhag. They all have their own local customs. There are lots of similarities, but things will vary from rabbi to rabbi, from cantor to cantor, from board to board, from congregation to congregation. But we're still pretty much the same. If you go to any synagogue, any Reformed synagogue in the world, you will hear some of the same melodies. You will hear some of the same prayers. And that's part of, and you will hear the same Torah portions, of course, everywhere in the world, because we're all reading the same thing for the most part every Shabbat. So that's the beauty really of what's happening now. And I personally like, again, that our Reform movement is becoming a little more traditional. As a rabbi, I enjoy seeing my congregants wear a kippah and knowing that you should wear a talit when the Torah is out, and learning more Hebrew because that is the language of our religion. So when I hear people say, why do we have to have all this Hebrew? It's, a little disconcerting to me. Now, just for one more minute, I'll say that I'm also a member of the Union for Reform Universalist Communities. This is sort of a new movement, and it's called Universalist Judaism. I was ordained at a Universalist school that takes people from all denominations of Judaism. We had people who were Orthodox all the way through Reconstructionist at the seminary where I studied. And we are very welcoming and inviting. There is no one that we would exclude. We embrace the fact that we are here as partners with God to make the world a better place, and we work toward that. And we feel that every person is a chosen person, a chosen son or daughter of God.
I started, when I was looking at your bio, I started reading up on that a little bit because I had never heard of that before. So it sounds fascinating.
It's new, yeah, but I love it because I do same-sex marriages. I have a lot of people in my conversion classes who are on the fringes of different things. They find a home with Judaism. And I really think that's lovely. And that comes from really my Universalist teachings that I've learned.
Wonderful. And I also grew up in a pretty, in a synagogue that was kind of transforming from classical reform to more modern in the 90s, kind of so it was interesting to see during my time growing up, the rabbis changed from wearing the robes to wearing the suits.
Right.
And from one mode of prayer to using a guitar more often. So it was
right
really during my childhood where all of that changed in my Reform synagogue. Are there any questions for Rabbi Judy before we move on?
Not for me. I have to absorb. I took good notes.
Yeah.
I just need to absorb them now.
It's hard to learn all about one movement of Judaism in 15 minutes.
Right.
But keep absorbing, and if we've got more
And
questions.
I'll stay here. I'll stay on the call if you think of anything later.
Wonderful. I'd like to invite now Rabbi Emily. Are you Rabbi Emily, Rabbi Cohen?
Rabbi Emily is great. Thank
Rabbi
you.
Emily's great. So she is representing Reconstructing Judaism right now. She is the rabbi of West End Synagogue, but I know that you have also been the rabbi in other places, and you've serve lots of roles. I know I've seen you write a lot in different Jewish publications. So we are curious to know a little bit more about reconstructing Judaism and where you see your Judaism also.
Amazing. Thanks for inviting me, and it's nice to see you, Rabbi Sydney. It's been we studied together in
see
Jerusalem
you.
years ago, so it's fun to reconnect a little bit. So I'll give kind of the elevator pitch on like what Reconstructionist Judaism is. The movement is called Reconstructing Judaism. The type of Judaism is still called Reconstructionist. It's confusing. We make mistakes within the movement all the time. So feel free to use either and we'll know what you're talking about. But it is an American movement. It started really, it's the newest of the mainstream movements. If we're talking about the movements that are going to be spoken about on the call today, it's been around for about a century in thought. The rabbinical school, the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, where I was ordained, has been around for about 50 years now. And the movement was founded by Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan. So one of the things that's interesting about the Reconstructionist movement is that there is like a singular person who created a lot of the thought and methodology around it. And since it's a new movement, we know a lot about that person's life, that person's evolution of thought. In fact, his biographer, Professor Mel Skolt, is in his 80s and is one of my congregants, and like, studied with him intensely, and sort of has like so whenever I speak about Kaplan during services, I'm always like looking over at Mel, like, am I getting this right? Because he's, still sitting there. So it's a movement that's really based on the idea of Judaism as a civilization. And I saw in the email that Rabbi Sydney sent a question about like, is it a religion or a culture, like maybe some of both? And that was the same sort of question that Kaplan was wrestling with. And the idea that Jews are certainly practitioners of a faith, but we also do have Jewish culture, and that's a major part of who we are, and Jews as a people. So you can have a totally secular Jew who, would never go to synagogue, wouldn't pray, wouldn't necessarily have, a bar mitzvah or a Jewish wedding, but would still have a Jewish identity to some extent because of the family in which they were raised, or because of, just what they know about their own family history. And that's something that I think distinguishes it a little bit from other religious traditions, that, it really is something that you're able to take on in something that encompasses religion, but also can include many things beyond religion. So Kaplan talked about American Jews specifically as living in two civilizations. So American Jews are living in April right now, but we're also living where, tonight we'll be moving into the 4th week of the Omer, and like we're holding both of those realities side by side, our Jewish understanding of things and our American understanding of things. And in the last century, the movement has expanded a little bit beyond the United States. We have affiliates in Canada. I want to say there's one in somewhere in the Netherlands. Like there are a few that are scattered around outside the US, but it certainly is American grown, and the vast majority of Reconstructionist congregations are in the United States. Kaplan also believed really strongly, and this is a distinguishing factor between Reconstructionist Judaism and other forms of Judaism, in the idea that chosenness, like the Jews being chosen among all the people, was not correct. So his belief was that Jews were not a chosen people. And if you look at Reconstructionist liturgy, you'll actually see some shifts in the Hebrew. So if you're familiar with the blessings for being called up to the Torah, for example, there's a line, Asher bachar banu mikol ha'amim, that chose us from among all the people. And Reconstructionists say, Asher kerbanu la'avodato, that brought us close to like the service of the Divine One. So there's other liturgical shifts like that. There's a lot of different Reconstructionist theologies. So Kaplan himself did not believe in a supernatural God, which means that things like the splitting of the sea would not have been something that he would have believed was possible. In modern Reconstructionist communities, there's a lot of people that feel differently about that, and some people that do believe in a more personal God, along with, of course, many people that hold something more like Kaplan's view. And then we also have a lot of atheists within our communities, because again, they're connecting to the idea of Judaism as a peoplehood and a civilization more so than just a set of theologies. As far as halakha, which I heard Rabbi Ginsburg speak about a moment ago, so there's law, of course, but there's this idea. So we are sort of a halachic considering movement, and what I mean by that is, the short version is learn the rules so you can choose which ones you're going to break. So there's a lot of emphasis on study in Reconstructionist communities and on considering multiple perspectives on things, but then ultimately on making one's own decisions, often in a communal context. So for example, at my synagogue, which is in New York City, I have congregants that would very happily eat shrimp cocktail, and I have congregants who keep a strictly kosher home. At the synagogue, we maintain a kosher kitchen because that's a communal space. And so anybody who's bringing food from the outside in needs to abide by that communal norm. But I, as the rabbi of that synagogue, don't expect that my congregants will all maintain kosher homes. I expect that they will learn about kashrut and make decisions according to values in consultation with both the Jewish community and the American community in which they dwell. Just trying to get through a few of these questions. As far as approach to gender and LGBTQ issues, it is a new movement, as I said, relatively speaking. So the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College has always been open to people of all genders. The movement was the first to openly ordain LGBTQ rabbis and continues to be on the vanguard of inclusivity in a lot of different respects. So certainly with LGBTQ folks, we also have a lot of people within the movement who've converted to Judaism. We are extremely open to interfaith families. I'm patrilineal, so my mother is not Jewish, but I was raised Jewish, and I had no problem being ordained in the Reconstructionist movement. And so, in that sense, I would say that the definition of who is a Jew in Reconstructionism is either you convert, and Reconstructionist rabbis have the same expectations of mikveh and beit din as you would find in other movements, or you're born and raised in a Jewish home. So if you're born to a Jewish parent and a non-Jewish parent, but you're raised in the non-Jewish parent's tradition, you would not be considered Jewish in the Reconstructionist movement. But if you're born to one Jewish parent and one non-Jewish parent and you're raised Jewish, then it doesn't matter whether it was a mother or a father who was Jewish. So, I'll wrap in a second and see if there's any questions, but I would say the big things to keep in mind with Reconstructionism, if somebody asks you what are the differences, are very socially progressive. Liturgically, it would probably, in many Reconstructionist congregations, would actually probably seem more conservative than Reform. If you walked into my shul on a Saturday morning, you would see a lot of prayer that's very similar to what you would find in a conservative community, a lot of Hebrew, a lot of sung pieces of the liturgy, a little bit less English than I grew up with in a Reform community. And although I know that's changing as well, which is really cool. And egalitarianism for sure. So men, women, non-binary folks, all kind of able to partake equally in the community. And a big range of practice. I'll end with an interesting anecdote that when I was living in Israel, when I was in school, I was studying with a mix of conservative students, Reconstructionist, Reform, just a big group of Americans who were all on their various Israel years at the time. And the conservative students all kept kosher, no question. That was just an expectation and what they are doing in their practice. The Reform students mostly did not. And the Reconstructionist students were all over the place. So I remember having a conversation with some friends who were at Rabbi Sidney's school, and they were saying that they had to sign something when they entered, saying that they were going to maintain a kosher home, and then if you were invited to their home for Shabbos or something, you'd know it was kosher. In the Reform school, that was not the expectation, and you could sort of assume that it wouldn't be kosher unless otherwise specified. And at RRC, you had to ask. Because I had classmates who maintained strict kosher homes. I couldn't bring stuff from my vegetarian dairy kitchen because it wasn't all hechshered ingredients. And then you had people that would go out for bacon cheeseburgers, and it was we were all in the same community. So it's interesting and it's messy. And it's fun for me. And I also have worked in post-denominational spaces as well. And so what I would say is there's just a huge explosion of Jewish huge, just like different Jewish experiences that are available right now. So as you're going through your learning, like, it's great if you have a shul home, but if you have a Shabbat where you're not, otherwise obligated and it's your practice to go on to computers on Shabbat to go to services, like I would say just like check out some different places because there's just so much exciting stuff happening. So if it's within your practice to use electronics on Shabbat to attend services, check it out. I'm sure that Rabbi Sidney has a list of recommendations. I would as well, and you're welcome to check out West End if you'd ever like to. So I'll pause there.
Anyone have questions? And I think it's also good to recognize that Mordechai Kaplan really influenced the thought of other movements as well, especially that idea of chosenness. Even though other movements don't make that same liturgical change, it kind of challenged other movements to rethink how we talk about chosenness. So huge Reconstructionist movement was a huge influence just in general on all of Judaism. And you are welcome. I know that you've got meetings and things, but you're welcome to stick around as long as you'd like.
Yeah, I'm sorry I can't stay. I would have loved to, but I have to run out to a meeting in a couple of minutes. But I'm really glad I was able to be with y'all. And if you have questions, Rabbi Sidney has my contact info. I'm happy to be in touch. So
thank you so much. And I would love to invite Rabbi Pernick. I don't know different rabbi names. I should ask.
Yeah, Josh is good.
Josh is good. Okay, I would love to invite him to talk a little bit about Orthodoxy, and keeping in mind this is the case with all movements, right? But Orthodoxy, I think in particular, there is so much diversity. So one person who says they're Orthodox, another Orthodox person might not see as Orthodox, and there are a whole bunch of different descriptors in there. So so Josh is going to tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Sidney. So, and I think that's a great way to start and kind of a great framing, because I'd say unlike conservative reform, reconstruction, or reconstructing, Orthodoxy isn't a movement in the same sense. It's many movements that is just kind of a catch-all for everything. I'd say at some level that's not associated with a formal movement. I'll get into that a little bit. So I'll just to give a little bit of background. So I did not grow up Orthodox. My dad's a Reform rabbi. I studied at Pardes with Rabbi Sidney, which is where we know each other, in Israel, which is a non-denominational seminary, and ultimately ended up going to become an Orthodox rabbi. When I was at Pardes, I was pretty much, my practice, I would say, was pretty much Orthodox, and then ultimately went into the rabbinate there. I worked as a synagogue rabbi in New Orleans for 3 years in Metairie, and now I'm in New Haven, Connecticut, and I work with the Jewish Federation. So if people know the Jewish Federation, sort of the, in some way, the Jewish community umbrella. So I work with all the synagogues and all the different denominations. I'm actually just coming now from a meeting we had at the end of year for our community-wide Intro to Judaism class. So this is a great combination Intro to Judaism kind of afternoon for me. Thinking about Orthodoxy and where it originates, again, it's a little bit different than the others because for centuries, millennia really, you had divergent Jewish practice, but without formal names attached, right? Sometimes you might hear about Ashkenazi Jewry versus Sephardic versus Yemenite, right? Jews living in different places. And of course, there were various levels of practice and observance. So not everyone was, followed all the law, or some people followed none of the law, and so, right? But there was sort of a common understanding of what, there is this idea of Jewish law that is practiced in whatever community we're living. And again, that differed community by community, and even within one city, you might have had different practice, really until the Enlightenment era, when sort of new forms of Judaism started coming around, and new ways of thinking. And Orthodoxy was sort of the like really a response to really reform, and then conservative came later as the people who were not, I don't want to say not changing because everyone is changing all the time, but people who were sort of trying to maintain the practice that had been, at least to the best of their abilities, as it had been done before, as opposed to say reform, who is about making changes and trying to reform the tradition. Orthodoxy was, as, or what would become known as orthodoxy, was the one saying, no, we're not changing things, we're kind of keeping things the same. And that, when we get into the question of Jewish law and practice, I'd say to some extent, right, that has been what defines orthodoxy. And if you have questions or comments, feel free to chime in. But I'd say generally speaking, all of the different groups and movements and everything that call themselves Orthodox, I think what they have in common is an attempt to the best of their abilities, live a Jewish life in concert with Jewish law as traditionally understood by going back to the earliest sources, the Hebrew Bible, through to the Talmud, through to the different generations of rabbinic thought, as codified in what's known as the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law, and then to later commentary. So, as I said, there is always change, but generally sort of seeing that corpus of law as really the framework for living life. And then as new questions arise, trying to figure out how to respond to new questions, new situations that arise within that framework, while as changing the framework as little as possible. Now, of course, life changes, the world changes, and we'll get into this a little bit with the other pieces, the other sort of like sub-questions here. But I say that's right. So orthodoxy can be anyone from people who live totally, insular lives in communities where they're pretty much cut off in many ways from the modern world, to me, who's very much in the modern world and working across denominations. But we're all sort of broadly under this kind of umbrella of orthodoxy, which by virtue of not being affiliated with the other movements, and often having some sort of association with umbrellas, whether like the Orthodox Union, who's known mostly for their kashrut, for having their kosher stamps on items, but that's somewhat of an umbrella, at least of parts of the Orthodox world. So like the congregation I served in New Orleans was a member of the Orthodox Union. But like I said, it's also much more of a free-for-all than the other movements. When I finished my rabbinic training, there was no sort of union in the way that there are in the other movements. I didn't join into a professional organization that had, synagogues are not, they might be members, but there isn't the same kind of structures of movement as there are in the other denominations. Any questions before I move on to the other pieces?
I'm curious how you came to, and maybe you're going to explain this, but I'm curious how you came to Orthodoxy and what drew you there growing up Reform, because I realized that all four of us who are speaking today grew up in the Reform movement.
Fascinating. Oh, interesting. Yeah, so for me, I grew up in the Reform movement with a dad who's a Reform rabbi, and then also somewhat in the conservative movement because I went to a Camp Ramah, a conservative movement summer camp. So, and my mom's family was sort of on the, let's say, traditional conservative. So we kind of had a variety of these influences. And when I was in college, I went to Brandeis University outside Boston, where there's a strong Reform and a strong conservative and strong Orthodox communities. And so I was able to kind of float between all of them, which was really comfortable. And really only towards the end of college did I start even dipping my toe in the Orthodox community. I knew the Orthodox rabbi on campus. I had taught his son at the preschool on campus. And so I, spent time with them. And so that was when I kind of first, I would say, dipped my toe into Orthodoxy. And then after college, I moved to Charleston, South Carolina. And there also I kind of floated, but really found my home within the Orthodox community. I'd say one of the things that differentiated the Orthodox communities, in my experience, like in Charleston, from the other communities, was sort of a sense of common practice and really Shabbat. That if I was spending Shabbat in the Orthodox community, people sort of had a sense like this is a full day adventure we're going through together. They would go over to each other's houses for meals, hanging out. Friday night and Saturday day was kind of. It is also part of being in a small community that people is very much like family. Everyone would kind of spend the day together. Whereas when I went to the other communities, it was more like, okay, people go to services and then they would go to the college football game because it's, South Carolina. And I felt like, I would float between them, but I much preferred spending those Shabbatot, those Shabbats in those weekends when I was in the Orthodox community where I could just sort of hang with people all day. And then my practice kind of came in line as I was thinking about what kind of life I wanted to live. And so it kind of eventually my practice sort of came to follow the communities that I chose to make my home within. So even when I was at Pardes, I didn't identify as Orthodox, though practically I was. And it was really only when I applied to rabbinical school that I was like, I guess I have to call myself Orthodox now because I'm going to be going to an Orthodox rabbinical school. And now, I still consider myself Orthodox, but I'm not in a synagogue world, so it's interesting. Theoretically, I could call myself whatever I want, but I just, to me, it's just being a Jew and trying to live in accordance with that framework of of Judaism as I understand it, historically. So, yeah, thank you for that question, Rabbi Sidney. So we'll get into some of the questions around gender, who's a Jew, and so forth. Right, these conversations play out differently I think in every movement. I think some would say, oh, okay, Orthodox, like everyone else is, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructing are kind of making changes when it comes to gender and like Orthodox, and LGBTQ issues, and Orthodoxy isn't. And of course, it's more complicated than that. I think change happens in all movements, but just in different ways and at different speeds. So one of the major differences between Orthodoxy and other movements is that men and women sit separately, right? So when we're thinking about gender in this, in the construct of gender, what do you do when there's a mechitza, a divider, and men sit on one side and women sit on the other side? And in the world we're living in which people either identify as non-binary or transgender and so forth, right? So these kinds of questions are all things that, at least on the liberal side of Orthodoxy, right, people are grappling with these questions. What do where do people sit? As far as even life cycle events, right? Generally speaking, there's no accepted same-sex marriage ceremony, for example, within Orthodoxy. It's very controversial. There's been a couple Orthodox affiliated rabbis who've performed same-sex marriages, and that's been very controversial. So it's in that area, like very, I would say, different than the other movements, but there's also, right, these conversations happening constantly about what framework exists, right? When you're trying to live your life within a certain framework and saying, okay, well, how can we, within this framework of Jewish law, again, going from the Talmud and beyond, how do we fit these changing conceptions of gender and sexual orientation and so forth within these structures as they exist? So there's a lot of work being done in that area, but it's certainly not the acceptance of like same-sex marriage and of gay or trans rabbinical students, right? All of that looks different within Orthodoxy, and even on the progressive wing of Orthodoxy, where I'm sort of situated. So there's work being done, but it's just a much slower process. And of course, happy to answer any questions or comments you have about that. And I'll just touch on the question of who is a Jew. So there's this understanding of matrilineal Judaism, that someone whose mother is Jewish is Jewish sort of no matter what, essentially. And then as far as conversion, again, more complicated, but generally someone who's been through a conversion under Orthodox auspices, or sort of basically under Orthodox auspices, is accepted as Jewish within within Orthodoxy, though even there, because we're not a movement, it's not so simple. If I were to officiate, if I were to oversee a conversion as an Orthodox rabbi with 2 other Orthodox male rabbis as the Beit Din, that doesn't mean that people on other parts of the Orthodox world, particularly like more in the Haredi or ultra-Orthodox wings, would accept my conversion and my declaration of this person's Jewish status. So whereas within like the conservative movement or reform movement, I think universally, if a conservative rabbi oversees a conversion, everyone within that movement will accept it. It doesn't work that way within Orthodoxy. It's more based on who is the rabbi, do we know them, do we trust them, were they part of some sort of broader organization, or do they do it on their own? So not so simple, but generally either matrilineal or a conversion done under Orthodox auspices are sort of what's accepted as far as who's a Jew. I'm going to pause here because I feel like that was a lot of things, and someone might be a little unfamiliar or foreign. So happy to respond to anything.
I'm curious, Joyce or Sephora, do you have questions for Rabbi Josh?
I have a question in general that maybe some of you might be able to answer. So I'm a licensed mental health counselor, and I work, I have a telehealth practice that's international. And so right now I work with all kinds of people, but also have a lot of LGBTQ individuals who, many of which will say that they feel close to God, they want to worship God, they want to be close to God, but their efforts to find a place where they feel at home, or they feel that they're not judged, they can just be close to God, connected to God, they've had trouble. So what would you say as far as in the Jewish community where they might find home, or a place where they feel that they can be themselves and still worship God?
Yeah,
What might I tell them?
Yeah, no, so that's such a great question. And these questions and conversations are happening, I would say, probably at least as much in the Jewish world as in the broader society. There are a number of organizations that focus specifically on LGBTQ rights in the Jewish world, some of which are under Orthodox auspices, or people who grew up Orthodox. So 2 organizations that come to mind are Eshel, ESHEL is one, and another is called JQY, which is Jewish Queer Youth. So both of those have they have drop-in centers and sort of support groups, and also I think they call it a cold line, like not a hotline, like it's not staffed constantly, but they have people available during certain hours. Thank you, Judy, for putting that in the chat. So these are a couple like major organizations in the Jewish world. Again, who JQY and Eshel both serve primarily the Orthodox community, or people coming out of the Orthodox community. There's also other organizations, one called Keshet, that's more sort of non-denominational. And this question of belonging is such an important one. So actually, my brother, who does not identify as Orthodox, but he and he's gay, and he works for my rabbinical school that I went to, which is an Orthodox rabbinical school, as their like LGBTQ outreach person. And part of that is trying to figure out what does leadership look like in the Jewish world. What pathways are there for people, whether it's the rabbinate. There was a big blow up when one of my classmates in rabbinical school ended up not being granted ordination because he was gay and engaged to his partner. And so that was sort of a big blow up, I guess, in 2019, so 4 years ago. And since then, they've been trying to figure out what is it, are there pathways for us, gay students that we feel comfortable to give them ordination, and also what other pathways for people who aren't going to be rabbis but are looking to be leaders in the Jewish community. And so actually, I was talking with a teacher of mine in Rabbi Sidney's. I was just in Jerusalem 2 weeks ago, and Pardes, where we studied, said they have a lot of these students, for example. And when I was at Pardes, most of the people who I learned with were gay and sort of Orthodox tangentially connected to the Orthodox world. And they said, like, this is the only place that I can engage in serious text study because yeshivas won't accept, right? The mainstream yeshivas, Orthodox yeshivas wouldn't accept them because they were openly gay. So now it's thinking about, Pardes and Meyer rabbinical school, these places of sort of high-level Jewish learning, thinking about, okay, what pathways can we create for people? What kind of partnerships can we create so that people feel like I can live an out gay, Jewish life and feel a sense of belonging and that I don't have to hide who I am. So like I said, a lot of work being done, but struggle for mainstream acceptance for sure as well. And a lot of synagogues that will not either accept same-sex couples or their children into Jewish day schools and things like that.
My congregation in Monroe is very welcoming of
Mhm.
all kinds of people. In fact, I do a lot with conversion, and I have 4 people that I'm working with right now who are trans.
Mhm.
I hear this all the time when they come to our congregation, that the minute we walked in, we felt like we were at home.
Mhm.
But again, it's going to depend on the congregation. I think some congregations are less judgmental than others. I am very proud that our congregation in Monroe gives off that air. I'm not, that's not to say that everybody there feels that way, but at least, I think the majority of the people who come to Shabbat services regularly and are there to greet anybody new who walks in the door, they're very welcoming, they're curious, they want to know more, they're not as judgmental perhaps as others. And I've had numerous LGBTQ trans people tell me that they feel very comfortable in our midst.
That's great. Yeah.
And it's
Um,
similar. Sorry.
Yeah, I'll just say, I know when I was in New Orleans or in Metairie, I had a conversation with someone from Eshel because they have this, what they call their Welcoming Shoals project, which is basically trying to create a list of synagogues who at least aspire to be welcoming that they have on their website. So if someone, an LGBTQ identified Jew or someone exploring Judaism says, I want to find a synagogue where I know I can walk through the doors and I won't be judged, or at least the synagogue aspires to be non-judgmental, right? And so they have a list of synagogues that we were on. Now, of course, being on a list doesn't mean that in practice that plays out, because I also had a number of trans people who are part of, particularly my Jewish learning, not as many historic members, but people who are involved in Jewish learning or exploring conversion. And I will say it was, the fact that we declared to be welcoming doesn't always mean that everyone lived that out in practice. So, right, there's always that kind of struggle as well.
Right. And I think in all movements, like both of you are saying, it really depends on the congregation, and not the congregation so much what the congregation says or what the rabbi says, but the people in the congregation, like the community in the congregation. So at Agudath Achim, because we're so small, I think I've seen different attitudes throughout just the 4 years that I've been here. So in theory, the conservative movement, for the most part, is open to people of different genders, of different sexual orientations. You'll find, because there are the conservative movement has different stances that rabbis can take. Some of the older rabbis are not as accepting, but most of the rabbis of the conservative movement are going to officiate at same-sex weddings and are going to be accepting of people who are LGBTQ in their congregations. But it really depends on who the congregants are and what kind of space there is. I think over the past few years, as we've gotten a few more people who identify as LGBTQ, I think we've become a little bit more welcoming of a space. Then I think when I came in, it was a little bit more don't ask, don't tell. We're welcoming of everybody, but just don't talk about it. I think now we've changed a little bit in that with the people who have come in. But I'm guessing that it'll be a different situation in another few years when we've got a whole new group of people. We actually last year had a whole learning series about welcoming. How can we be a more welcoming space? And we talked about how do we call people up to the podium, the bima, in a way that's affirming of gender. So we have those conversations all the time. Was there more that you wanted to share, Rabbi Josh?
I think that's, I would say all I have on my end prepared. Like I said, I'm happy to talk more. It's actually interesting because my position now with the Federation is actually focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion, at least in part. So actually a lot of the LGBTQ issues and working with synagogues, right, is like a part of my everyday. And like I said, there's in every congregation this looks different, and the rabbi can't necessarily they try to set the tone, but ultimately it's a push and pull between all the different components of any institution. So yeah, anyway, thank you so much for inviting me to speak.
Thank you. I'm going to share a little bit about conservative Judaism, and then Rabbi Josh and Rabbi Judy, if you would like to stay on, you are welcome to, because I think we'll plug in a little bit of a piece of the puzzle. So as I said before, conservative Judaism is often called Big Tent Judaism. We're kind of the middle ground, and some people are frustrated by that because conservative Judaism doesn't have a great definition, but I think it's exciting because it's a place where people of different opinions about what Judaism is can come together and meet in the middle, in a sense. So historically, we heard about the evolution of Orthodoxy and Reform Judaism. Late 19th century, Rabbi Judy mentioned the Treif banquet. So there were some things about Reform Judaism. With the rabbis and the scholars who were involved in Reform Judaism, there were some steps that the Reform movement took that were just too far for some people. So the Treif banquet is one of those major things. They were not into eating frog legs. We want to reform things a little bit, but that's just going too far. And so the rabbis who thought things were going too far kind of started this positive historical Judaism. And it started both in Germany and in America, but really took off in America. And so end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, it really started as a scholarly movement of positive, at the beginning called positive historical Judaism. At the same time that these scholars were trying to figure out how do we bring Jewish law, how do we bring halakha into the modern world, because we recognize that the modern world changes. At the same time, you've got a lot of immigrants who are coming from Eastern Europe. So these scholars were mostly were either American-born or from Germany. You've got a lot of immigrants who are coming from Eastern Europe who are used to these services that are very traditional. They want to pray in Hebrew. Regardless of what their practice looks like outside of the synagogue, they want to pray in Hebrew. They want their service to look like it did in the old world. And so you've kind of got those two groups of people who are coming together where there's an assumption that Jewish law is that Jewish law is sacred, right? The Torah is holy, that the Talmud is holy, that Jewish law is what it is, and is an aspiration. But at the same time, we want to be a part of the modern world. So what that became was really what we know now as conservative Judaism. One of the ways that we look at this is tradition and change. It's a good framework, tradition and change. So we see the Torah and the Talmud as sacred. And we know that the ways in which we read the Torah and the Talmud teach us that our practice has to change as a society and technology and our understanding of the world changes. The way that halakha, the Jewish law, was developed was all about change in itself. Right? We start out with the Torah, but once the temple was destroyed, we had to figure out, what do we do with all of these sacrifice-based laws when we no longer have sacrifice? What do we do with all of these laws about keeping Shabbat when electricity comes down the line? And so we really grapple with these questions, and we balance that tradition and change. So the practical result is that your average conservative affiliated Jew may not seem as outwardly observant as an Orthodox affiliated Jew. Now that's not universal, but it's maybe your average conservative affiliated Jew, but that synagogue space acts as that ideal to work towards. So in our synagogue space, we keep Shabbat. In our synagogue space, we have a kosher kitchen, and we make sure to look at the kosher symbols on the labels. Right? Our service looks very much like an Orthodox service would look, except that it's egalitarian. So a really simple way to distinguish an Orthodox synagogue from a conservative synagogue is that a conservative synagogue is going to have men and women praying together. Not only are we going to have men and women praying together, but women are going to be reading from the Torah and are going to be acting as rabbis, even though in the Orthodox movement there are some female rabbis or some female leaders that act as rabbis. But in the conservative movement, in most of the conservative movement, it's egalitarian with men and women, people of all genders praying in the same space. The way that I like to see this too is that because we see these mitzvot as sacred, our goal is to take on a little bit more of that life of mitzvot every day. We might not be perfect at it right now, and we're open about the fact that we're not perfect about it right now, but the synagogue gives us this model of where we would like to be. So we take on new mitzvot every day. We take on new commandments every day to get towards that ideal. And I'm there too, right? One stereotype of a conservative synagogue is that the rabbi is the person who keeps all of the mitzvot, and then you've got all of the people in the synagogue who will go out after shul and eat a cheeseburger. But so like the rabbi is the holy person representing everybody else, but I don't see it that way, right? I certainly am not observing halakha to the extent that I would like to be observing halakha. I'm trying to work on one more mitzvah every day, and I try to act as a model of what it's like to live a life of mitzvot, but and I'm trying to teach it in a way that others will be inspired to take on one new mitzvah every day, even if it's a different mitzvah than the person next to them. Right? So halakha as an aspiration, not an assumption. We in the conservative movement see women as just as obligated to all of the mitzvot, to all of the commandments as men. Everyone of all genders is obligated to all of the commandments, except for the ones attached to anatomy. Some of the, like circumcision, women aren't obligated to circumcision, but we lead services, we count towards the number of people, the 10 Jews that count in a prayer quorum, in a minyan. We wear the talit, the prayer shawl, and the tefillin. But even that, you'll see some women who in our service will not wear a talit, will not wear a prayer shawl, because they grew up in a world where the conservative movement had not yet gotten to that place of egalitarianism. Most conservative rabbis, as I said before, will agree to perform same-sex marriages and will embrace the LGBTQ community, but again, not completely universal. When we ask the question of who is a Jew, we would see someone as halachically Jewish, as Jewish according to Jewish law, if they were born from a Jewish mother, so that's the matrilineal descent, or went through a conversion process that includes mikvah, which is a ritual bath, and Mila, which is circumcision, right? So the men have to be circumcised, and Beit Din, which is a learning process that ultimately ends in a group of 3 rabbis or 3 knowledgeable Jews who form a sort of court and ask lots of questions, create an interview sort of process. So those are the 3 steps: mikvah, the ritual bath; Mila, circumcision; and Beit Din, which is that court of 3 rabbis or educated Jews. Now, kind of like what Josh was saying, if I'm on a Beit Din, because I'm female and because I'm a conservative rabbi, my conversions may not be accepted by the Orthodox movement. But I'll say even openly as well. So I know that Rabbi Judy has done a lot of conversions at B'nai Israel. And And sometimes those conversions don't follow the same patterns of Jewish law that we expect for mikvah, for the ritual bath, or for circumcision. And so what I will do in those kinds of situations is that if she's got a member of the congregation who has gone through the conversion process with her, or with Rabbi Jana also, I trust that they've gotten the education, because both Rabbi Jana and Rabbi Judy and anybody in the Reform movement or other recognized movements, I trust that they've gone through a whole lot of personal exploration and education. What I'll do from them is help guide them through the process of circumcision, obviously referred to somebody else, and the process of mikvah and a court of 3 rabbis. So making sure that those halachic steps are in process. For me, I also think it's important to talk about how I chose conservative Judaism, because like everybody else here, I grew up in the Reform movement. So I grew up in the Reform movement, and like Josh, I went to Pardes after college. I went to this learning center in Jerusalem, and a lot of the teachers there are Orthodox. And in Israel, I got to experience what it's like to live a life of everyday Judaism, a life where I'm not alone in practicing mitzvot. I'm inspired by the people around me to live my Judaism every day, to eat kosher, to have a prayer, to pray 3 times a day, to say blessings before I eat meals and after I go to the bathroom, right? All of those kinds of mitzvot. And I was really inspired by that, and I loved it. And at the same time, I grew up with a female rabbi, and I grew up in a family of really, really strong women. And I was coming at this for the first time, this halakha for the first time, from the standpoint of text, because at Pardes, we studied a lot of text. So through reading the text, I couldn't read the text in a way other than providing for equal obligation to all of the mitzvot for people of all genders. So for me, I needed that egalitarianism. I needed that equality of all genders, in equality of expectation of all genders. So that's how I came to conservative Judaism. Was that middle point, right? It was both the egalitarianism and that sacred nature of mitzvot, and that sacred nature of halakha as a system in itself. And I've loved being here.
We love having you
Well,
here.
thank you. Thank you. So, and I love how all of us growing up in the Reform movement has kind of gone all of these different directions. And you'll hear that from a whole lot of different people. And Rabbi Feivel, in contrast, he's my husband in at Agudath Achim a lot. He grew up really all the way in the conservative movement. He was a part of a conservative synagogue and went to conservative Jewish camp and was on the board of the conservative youth movement. So he was conservative movement all the way. But we all take different paths to where we get. So that was a whole lot in an hour and 15 minutes or hour and 20 minutes. Yeah. And I know that right now we've got Sephora and Joyce on. We had Kratina on and off. We've also got a lot of people who have been emailing me that they're watching the videos as well. So we're not just us on the screen right now. But Sephora and Joyce, any other questions?
No, it is a lot to absorb.
Yes.
And I'll go home and read my notes, and I may have questions later, but right now I just want to absorb everything that I've heard.
And a good overview, because we did it in an interesting order. A good overview, even though it's certainly not concrete, is that if you're looking on the scale of Jewish observance, that Orthodox Judaism, in all of its different explanations, strives to be fully observant in Jewish law, and to preserve that as much as possible. right? The preservation of Jewish law first, right? Reform Judaism, Jewish law is really interesting and lots of great ideas, but as individuals, you get to choose what are those that are sacred. And conservative Judaism is kind of in that middle space, right? Jewish law is sacred, and we recognize that times are changing. And so the way that we approach Jewish law changes as well. And Reconstructionist Judaism can be anywhere on that line of observance, but with that focus on Judaism as a civilization, and that chosenness is not supposed. Is there anything else you'd like to add to that, Rabbi Judy or Rabbi Josh?
No, I think you said that really well. I think, there's this question of when you have a conflict of values, and each of our movements responds to these conflicts of values differently. So when you have modernity bumping up against tradition, right, and that's really the primary conflict that all of our movements are in their own way trying to respond to. So Orthodoxy, when there's that conflict between modernity and tradition, sides more with tradition, and then everyone else sort of in their different places, but everyone is everyone is dealing with the conflict. No one is saying, oh, we're on the side of tradition or we're on the side of modernity. We all just end up on different parts of that spectrum of how you respond when there's that conflict between the two.
And even within the movements, there are differences.
Mhm.
Yes.
And it really just kind of comes down to what community do I feel comfortable in? Like Josh, you said that you were attracted to Orthodoxy because the people that you found and the community that you found within Orthodoxy. Part of the reason, even though the theoretical was really what brought me to conservative Judaism, part of it too was that I went to a summer program, and the staff, a lot of the staff went to the rabbinical school I ended up going to, and so they really inspired me. I wanted to be a rabbi like them, and so I ended up going to their rabbinical school. Right? So it's the people that you choose to be close to as well. So thank you. There's more that I would like to teach about Jewish diversity, but I think that's a lot to absorb. So I think next week is a good time to talk more about international Jewish diversity. Today, we really talked about Jewish diversity within North America and kind of Europe as well. But we really talked about mostly an American form of Jewish diversity today. So it's a lot to look at in your in the syllabus that I sent out. There are lots of websites. There are all the websites of these different movements. I would challenge you to click on them and click around, look at the galleries, what the prayer spaces look like, what services feel like. And in Shreveport, I know that we just have Agudath Achim and B'nai Zion, which conservative and reform. But like Rabbi Emily said, there are so many different services online, so many different places that you can stream. I know that Orthodox services usually aren't streamed over the weekends, but you can find a weekday service and see a little bit what that looks like as well. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rabbi Judy. Thank you, Rabbi Josh.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
Have a
Bye-bye.
wonderful afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.